what's been uniquely challenging for at least us, and I can't speak for everyone who's a practitioner or who advocate for the strategy, is over the course of 2023, I think the 2023 and even partially 2024, one of the most challenging, um, I wouldn't want to use the word narrative, but one of the challenging, I guess, narrative, I guess I will stick with that, is that we had a pretty short period of time where the interest rates were skyrocketing like crazy, right? And that was all to fight inflation. It was what the Federal Reserve was doing. So arguably one of the challenging things to overcome as practitioners and advocate was the question of, well, what about interest rates, right? I have a 3.5%, or some I meet 2.5% fixed rate mortgages. And many of them, ask that valid question of, how does it work with a 8% or 9% second lien position HELOC? So it was a very interesting time in 2023 and 2024 to have to overeducate on that. On It's not necessarily that we're fighting a battle with interest rates, or it's an interest rate game itself, which can be a factor for sure in some instances. But this strategy, accelerated banking, is not about interest rate versus interest rate. It's about time imbalance. How do we decrease the time imbalance of the average daily balance so that ultimately the cumulative interest cost is lower, even though the interest rate might be higher on, say, a second lien position HELOC? So that's the past. And I explain that because it's a context to what I'm about to share. And that is literally next week, or what we hope to be is next week, the Federal Reserve is supposedly announcing a potential rate cut, a federal fund rate cut. And that's exciting for many reasons. For one, it signals, at least from a macroeconomic perspective, that we may have been successful in fighting inflation. And, obviously, the cumulative inflation increase is still there. I mean, we still obviously have 50% increase on food costs and 30% increase on energy costs, right? We can't go back unless we have deflation. But fortunately, the inflation of 8-10%, those days are hopefully over. And what we're anticipating is a long-term inflation target of 2.5-2%, which is what the Federal Reserve is wanting. And so when the interest rates drop, what we would like to see happen is also the interest rate cost on credit cards, lines of credit, those to decrease as well, which is great for everyday consumers like you and me, where we go, grocery shop or whatever the case might be. What we hope to see is that the vast majority of the cost for line of credit will go down. And I hope this to be true for as well as people who have balances on their credit card, that lowering the interest costs will give them a little bit more of an edge to help fight credit card debt, which is something that I'm a huge advocate for as well. So the interest rate being cut, hope to see, 25, 50 basis point. If it's 50 basis point, great. It's even more accurate cut or aggressive cut. And I think the Fed has announced, or at least is implying, that they will cut three additional interest rates throughout the next 12 months. So very interesting, exciting times for both who are buying homes, but also who are looking to get into the accelerated banking strategy, because it just means additional cost savings over the next 12 to 18 months. So that's what I'm seeing, just from a high level. I mean, I don't know if you share the same insight, Denzel, but maybe I may have missed a detail or two.
So, real quick, just taking it to the whiteboard, you first brought up interest rate, and typically when we come across this strategy, people are comparing their mortgage to the potential HELOC that they're looking at. So quite often it's, rate versus rate. And not that you're evading that question, that genuine question
Right.
clients have. You're just simply saying there's something more important than the rate majority of the time. Like for me, I typically have, and you can chime in on this if you agree, but when I'm working with new clients that are acquiring, whether it's a HELOC, right, a personal line of credit, first or second, on the HELOC, I typically inform them to, look for rates below prime, right? So I'm always like an advocate of like, yeah, the rate's not as important, but if I can find the best HELOC, and if it only took me an extra week or two to do that research, instead of just going with the first bank that they look up, like Bank of America or like some big bank, and I'm like, hey, there's a local credit union around the block where you live, or about 5 miles, 10 miles out where you live, and they're doing an intro rate, zero closing costs, and then it's prime minus a certain percentage. So I'm always saying prime minus whatever the percentage is, and then some sort of intro rate tends to look very, very attractive. And I usually say, hey, I want to use your credit to get this first, right? Which is our main tool, right? Our main debt tool. I know I've heard you use that term before, the debt tool, and we're specifically referring to the banking products that we're using, right? So I have them go after this first, and then maybe a 0% credit card to attach to the line of credit, right? So I'm like, get your main tool first before we apply for 2 or 3 credit cards, right? That's typically how I'm educating clients to find the best tools for them. And then if I do have someone with those low rate mortgages in this particular space, if the line of credit is more than double to triple the rate, like if it's triple the rate, quite often I'm telling them, hey, I don't know if I love that. Like sometimes they want to use a 14% personal line of credit to start chunking at their 2-3% mortgage. And I'm like, especially if they're already like 5 to like 10 years in on that mortgage,
Right, right.
it's like really unattractive. So I'm like, hey, instead of that, why not get the HELOC, at like an intro rate of between like 3 and 6% out the gate, and then maybe it goes to prime minus 1, prime minus 0.5, which ends up being like maybe 7, 7.5, as opposed to 10 double digits. And then in general, typically if I'm dealing with a double digit rate, I avoid, right? So I just try to avoid that with a lot of clients in that particular case. So that's about as far as I go in terms of stressing on the rate versus rate. Where you talked about interest costs was referring to time and balance, which I think is really important, because there is a world where yes, the interest rate could be higher than what debt we're trying to eliminate. But if we were to look at, well, how long are we going to be at that high rate compared to the extra payments?
Right.
And I think where people do incorrect math is, let's say someone's got a cash flow of $1,500 a month, so that's what, 18,000 a year. So then they say, okay, if I make 18,000 in extra payments, they put that on the Excel, and they do the same thing for 18,000, say lump sum or chunk payment is what I typically is the language I'm using on my channel, right? So a lump sum or a chunk payment of 18 grand, and they assume that it's the same 12-month timeline.
Right.
And so when they run that and they go side by side and they look at 2 Excel spreadsheets or whatever, and they're like, dude, the math ain't mathin'. And then I let them know, well, yeah, I agree with you. I totally agree. It does not make sense to make a lump sum of 18 grand at this higher interest rate when you could have just made those same 18 grand payments over a 12-month period of time. But what we have to look at is, well, how long does it take me to actually remove that 18 grand in this higher interest rate line of credit when you factor in income expenses, credit card usage, like what is the time cost of money? What is the actual cost of money over what the rate is, right?
Right.
And I think often that's where the disconnect occurs, where I'm like, hey, it's not the same timeline typically. Plus, your spreadsheet is not honestly showing the impact of those extra payments. in terms of when they actually hit the mortgage. You know, mortgages are really old school, right? Like
Right.
whenever I like ask questions, try to get the client's amortization schedule or like the login portal, it's very archaic looking, like old. Um, you know, it takes a while to like get information. And when you go to actually make a payment to your mortgage, depending on what day, what time you make that payment, it may not actually hit the
Right.
balance for what the Excel is showing, right? Because if you show an extra payment on your Excel, it immediately
Hmm.
shows the impact, right?
Right.
But if we're at the end of a particular month, because that's typically when most people have cash flows at the end of a month, and you
Hmm.
already are in the new statement cycle of your mortgage, you have to
Right.
understand that until you make your next mortgage payment, they might hold that extra payment
Right.
because your mortgage payment has to get satisfied first.
Right.
Typically, I would say, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but your mortgage payment has to get satisfied first before you make an extra payment,
Right.
right?
Yeah,
So if that's the
most mortgage contracts are done that way. There's a priority of what satisfies first. It's like a container, right? It's like, okay, this like we're gonna first put in this bucket first, and then this bucket then gets filled. So they always fill the interest or any fees bucket, right? They always have to cover their butt. The banks always have to. If there's any outstanding fees, late fees, even if you have made the payment, whatever payment amount, what they do is they take a chunk of that and satisfy any late fees, extra, whatever fees, and then they'll cover the interest, and then they'll principal, right? So it's funny, again, I'm not saying the banks are inherently evil, but they're a business. I get it. They have to make money to
Mhm.
thrive. So again, it didn't cut you off, meant to cut you off there, but that's a very important point, right? Is
Yeah.
it matters in terms of sequencing.
Right, because in this world that we operate in,
Right.
every second counts, so to speak, or like
Right.
every day counts
Right.
when we're looking at average daily balance. So, you know,
Right.
most of people's calculations on Excels aren't doing enough justice to the strategy itself. And typically, I'm
Mhm.
always like underplaying velocity banking to prove a point, right? So I'm always
Right.
like making the results look worse than what they are. And quite often, I'm still coming out up ahead of these extra payments. Still, when you look at when you make that extra payment, especially between the cycle you're in and the next statement cycle, that
Mhm.
extra $1,500 payment won't get registered until your actual mortgage payment is paid. So let's
Right.
say that's another 7-8 days, and you have to understand the way amortization works.
Right.
It's a pre-scheduled timeline, right? Amortization is a form of payment, right? It's already laid out, and the only way to affect it is by paying the payment first and then adding more principal before
Right.
the statement cycle ends, right? to
Right.
to to make sure that next mortgage payment you're going to see the impact of less interest being charged on the next payments, right? So it's
Right.
almost like a month or two delay, I would say, in my opinion, of you making extra payments versus if you made that $18,000 extra payment on
Mhm.
January 1st at the top of the year.
Right.
That alone is going to impact what 18,000 over 12 months will do. That alone is a difference. But then now we
Right.
have to
And
look at our cost of money to do
right.
that in the home equity line of credit. And I think that's where the difference occurs, right?
Right.
That,
And
that
that
re-
18,000, right, that you're doing as far as quote unquote extra payment principal into the mortgage is also is accelerating the amortization. So subsequent payments after that on your amortization payment, um, more of it is now actually going towards principal. So your payments every month is now more efficient than pre January in your scenario. So yeah, no, excellent point. I would agree 100% on that.
yeah. So that's what I've heard so far. And then you also brought up that rates could be coming down. And correct me if I'm wrong on this, but when it comes to when the Fed announces a rate, immediately as it relates to home equity lines of credits, I don't know
Mhm.
about credit cards or PLOCs. I've typically have seen PLOCs stay the same.